At the time, this didn't seem important. It was introduced slowly, without debate, and most people accepted it as normal. No one felt harmed right away. The effects came later, after habits were already formed. By then, the change was everywhere, and very few people remembered how it started. There was a time when children spent entire afternoons outside without anyone planning it. No one scheduled it. No one supervised it in the way we think of supervision now. It simply happened, the way eating happened or sleeping. And then, gradually, it stopped happening. Most people alive today remember a version of childhood that included long stretches of unstructured time outdoors, and most people raising children today organize their lives in a way that makes such time nearly impossible. The transition between these two realities occurred without a single law being passed, without a formal announcement, without any clear moment when society decided this was the direction we were going. It simply became normal for children to be inside, and then it became unusual for them to be outside alone, and then it became unthinkable. And by the time anyone looked up to ask what had changed, the change was already complete. The shift didn't announce itself. There was no year when parents across the country suddenly agreed that outdoor play was dangerous. Instead, there were small decisions spread across decades, each one reasonable in isolation. A mother hears about a child who was hurt miles away, in circumstances nothing like her own, but the story lodges itself in her mind. A father notices that other children on the street are no longer outside and begins to wonder if he's missing something, if there's a risk he hasn't considered. A neighborhood becomes quieter, and that quietness becomes self-reinforcing. The fewer children outside, the stranger it seems to send yours out. At the time, no one framed this as a loss. It was framed as care, as responsibility, as the kind of vigilance good parents were supposed to demonstrate. Television played a role, though not in the way people often assume. It wasn't that programs were teaching children to stay inside. It was that television became a reliable way to know where a child was. In earlier decades, a child's location was more fluid, more assumed than tracked. They were out, and that was considered sufficient information. But as the culture began to shift toward more continuous awareness of children's whereabouts, television offered something useful. It offered stillness. A child in front of a screen was a child accounted for. This wasn't marketed as a replacement for outdoor play. It was simply easier. And over time, easier became normal. The physical environment was changing too, in ways that made outdoor play less intuitive. Neighborhoods that had once been designed with alleys, side streets, and informal gathering spaces were replaced by developments built around car traffic. Cul-de-sacs were considered safe, but they were also isolated. There were fewer places to walk to, fewer destinations a child could reach on their own. Front porches, which had once served as a casual threshold between private and public space, were replaced by back decks. People stayed in their yards, behind fences, instead of sitting where neighbors might pass by. The architecture of daily life quietly discouraged the kind of spontaneous interaction that had once made neighborhoods feel communal. And when that interaction disappeared, it took with it the informal supervision that had allowed children to roam. Most people didn't question it. The change was so incremental that it felt like a series of minor adjustments rather than a transformation. It blended into the texture of everyday life. Parents who had grown up playing in woods and creeks and empty lots found themselves driving their own children to playgrounds, sitting on benches while their children climbed structures designed to minimize risk. It didn't feel like a betrayal of their own childhoods. It felt like adaptation, like responding to a world that had become more complicated, more dangerous, more difficult to navigate without oversight. And because everyone around them was making similar adjustments, the changes felt not like choices, but like necessities. This wasn't discussed openly. There were no national conversations about whether children should spend less time outdoors. There were no public debates about the role of unstructured play in development. No policy papers weighing the benefits of freedom against the risks of injury or abduction. The shift happened in living rooms and at kitchen tables, in individual moments of worry and decision. And because it was so dispersed, so personal, it never cohered into something that could be examined or questioned as a whole. By the time researchers began studying the decline in outdoor play, the decline was already decades old. The studies didn't create awareness of a problem, they simply documented a transformation that had already occurred. What replaced outdoor play wasn't a single thing. It was a diffusion of activities, each one structured, each one supervised. Sports leagues, which had once been informal and child-organized, became professionalized, with uniforms and schedules and parents on the sidelines. Music lessons, tutoring, playdates arranged in advance and conducted under adult observation. These activities were valuable in their way. They taught skills, they built relationships, but they were fundamentally different from the kind of play they replaced. They were organized by adults for purposes adults had determined in environments adults controlled. The child's role was to participate, not to invent. And while participation has its own merits, it is not the same as agency. The real impact appeared years later. Researchers began noticing patterns in adolescents and young adults that hadn't been as pronounced in earlier generations. Difficulty with risk assessment, struggles with independence, a heightened sensitivity to danger, even in contexts that were objectively safe. These weren't universal traits, and they weren't diagnosable conditions, but they were observable tendencies, common enough to warrant study. And when researchers looked for correlates, one of the strongest predictors was the amount of unsupervised outdoor time a person had experienced as a child. Those who had spent significant time playing outside without adults directing the activity tended to be more comfortable with uncertainty, more willing to navigate unfamiliar situations, more capable of assessing risk in a nuanced way. Those who hadn't were more likely to feel overwhelmed by decisions, more reliant on external validation, more anxious in situations that required improvisation. This wasn't about nostalgia. It wasn't a claim that earlier generations were better or stronger or more competent. It was a recognition that certain kinds of experience shape certain kinds of capacity, and that when those experiences become rare, the capacities they build become rare too. Unstructured outdoor play wasn't valuable because it was wholesome or natural. It was valuable because it required children to solve problems that adults hadn't anticipated, to negotiate conflicts without mediation, to test their own limits in environments that provided immediate feedback. A child climbing a tree learned about balance and grip and height in a way that couldn't be taught in a classroom. A child navigating a dispute over game rules learned about persuasion and compromise and social hierarchy in a way that couldn't be replicated in a structured activity. These weren't lessons anyone was trying to teach, they were byproducts of freedom. By the time consequences were visible, habits were already set. Parents who had kept their children inside out of care found themselves with teenagers who were reluctant to go out, who felt unsafe in situations that previous generations would have considered mundane. Walking to a friend's house, riding a bike to the store, spending an afternoon without checking in. These had become, for many young people, sources of anxiety rather than sources of joy. And because their parents had never experienced this kind of anxiety themselves, there was often a disconnect, a sense that something was wrong but no clear language for what it was or how it had happened. The culture had shifted too. What had once been considered normal supervision, letting children play outside while parents remained nearby but not hovering, was now sometimes viewed as neglect. There were cases, scattered but widely publicized, of parents being questioned or even charged for allowing children to walk home from school alone, to play in parks without direct oversight, to occupy public space in ways that had been unremarkable a generation earlier. These cases were exceptions, not the rule, but they amplified a message that was already implicit in the culture: that children required constant supervision, that autonomy was a risk, that good parenting meant eliminating uncertainty. This created a feedback loop. Parents who might have been inclined to give their children more freedom hesitated, not because they personally believed their children were in danger, but because they worried about how other adults would perceive them. Teachers, neighbors, even strangers felt empowered to comment or report parenting decisions that deviated from the new norm. And so the norm reinforced itself not through consensus, but through social pressure, through the quiet accumulation of judgments and anxieties that made deviation feel risky. The economy played a role too, though this was rarely discussed in the context of childhood. As wages stagnated and household costs rose, more families required two incomes to maintain stability. This meant fewer adults were home during the day, fewer eyes on the street, fewer people available to provide the kind of diffuse, informal supervision that had once made neighborhoods feel safe. It also meant that children's time outside of school needed to be accounted for, structured, made predictable. After-school programs proliferated not because parents wanted their children in institutional settings for 10 hours a day, but because there was no alternative that fit the demands of adult work schedules. And so, childhood became more regimented, not because anyone thought regimentation was ideal, but because it was compatible with the way adult life was now organized. Technology accelerated the trend, but it didn't create it. Video games and smartphones are often blamed for keeping children indoors, and it's true that screens provided a compelling reason to stay inside. But screens filled a void that already existed. In an earlier era, a child who was bored might have wandered outside to see who else was around, but by the time screens became ubiquitous, there was often no one else around. The neighborhood was empty. The choice wasn't between outdoor play and screens, it was between screens and isolation. And given that choice, screens made sense. What made this particularly insidious was that it didn't feel like a failure, it felt like progress. Parents took pride in their vigilance, in their ability to keep their children safe and occupied and on track. Schools emphasized structure and achievement, measuring success in test scores and college admissions rather than in qualities like resilience or independence that were harder to quantify. Communities celebrated children who were busy, who were involved, who were managed. There was no cultural space to ask whether something had been lost because the dominant narrative was one of gain, of advancement, of doing better than the previous generation. The loss wasn't evenly distributed. Children in wealthier families had access to more structured activities, more private spaces, more resources to compensate for the absence of free outdoor play. Children in poorer families often had less supervision, but that lack of supervision wasn't experienced as freedom, it was experienced as neglect, because the neighborhoods they lived in were less safe, the streets more trafficked, the public spaces less maintained. The ability to roam, which had once been a near-universal feature of childhood, became a privilege accessible primarily to those whose families could afford to live in low-traffic areas with good infrastructure and low crime. And even in those areas, it was fading. By the early 2000s, researchers began using the term nature deficit disorder, though it wasn't a medical diagnosis. It was a way of naming a pattern they were observing. Children who spent little time outdoors exhibited higher rates of attention difficulties, mood disorders, and physical health problems. Again, this wasn't universal, and the correlations were complex, But the pattern was consistent enough to warrant attention. Time outdoors, particularly unstructured time in natural settings, appeared to have a regulatory effect on both physical and mental health. It wasn't that outdoor play was a cure for anything. It was that its absence created conditions where certain vulnerabilities were more likely to emerge. None of this was planned. No one set out to eliminate outdoor play. No corporation designed a strategy to keep children inside. No government enacted policies to reduce childhood independence. It happened through the aggregation of small, reasonable decisions made by people trying to do the right thing in a context that was shifting around them. A parent hears a story and decides to keep their child a little closer. A school eliminates recess to make more time for test preparation. A city replaces a wooded lot with a parking structure. Each decision makes sense in isolation, and each decision makes the next decision a little easier, a little more inevitable. What's striking is how little resistance there was. A few voices raised concerns, a few articles questioned the trend, but there was no organized pushback, no movement to preserve outdoor play the way there were movements to preserve wilderness or historic architecture. Childhood, as it had been experienced for generations, was allowed to disappear without much protest, largely because the disappearance was so gradual that it didn't register as an emergency. By the time people noticed, it was too late to reclaim what had been lost. The infrastructure was gone. The culture had shifted. The knowledge of how to let children roam safely had been forgotten, not because it was unimportant, but because it had become irrelevant. And this wasn't the only change. The same forces that enclosed childhood were enclosing other aspects of life too, in ways that wouldn't become visible for years. Similar decisions followed, in different domains with different consequences, but always with the same underlying logic: that safety required control, that structure was preferable to spontaneity, that risk was something to be eliminated rather than navigated. The pattern didn't stop with outdoor play. It was just one of the first places where it became visible.